A very good afternoon to all of you. It has been 2 days since the union budget was passed, and as usual, there has been significant chatter around it. The budget was met with several reactions, and people were generally curious to know the tax impact and the impact on the investment. To discuss all this and more, today we have with us two experts from Dhruva Advisors to discuss the tax implication and how will the budget impact your overall investment. Join me in welcoming Mr. Puneet Shah and Mr. Ritesh Kanodia to our webinar. We have with us Mr. Puneet Shah right now. He is a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants with over 30 years of experience in tax and regulatory matters. He specializes in banking and financial services and private equity sector and is widely recognized as a leader in this field. Mr. Ritesh Kanodia, who shall be shortly joining us, has over 15 years of experience and is a qualified lawyer and a chartered accountant. He has in-depth expertise in indirect tax, and his areas of proficiency include foreign trade policy as well as export control legislation. Welcome, Mr. Puneet Shah, to our webinar. Welcome to our platform. I would like to inform the attendees that there might be a time lag of 10 to 15 seconds due to network or connectivity issues. I request you to kindly bear with us. Over to you, Mr. Shah.
Thank you and good evening to all. Welcome to this webinar on the union budget. My partner Ritesh Kanodia and myself will be dealing with the tax proposals. I would be dealing with direct tax proposals and Ritesh would be dealing with indirect tax proposals. So with that, we straight jump into the presentation on the tax proposals. So if I may move to the next slide. The first, let's look at macroeconomic picture. Most of us have now read through most of these provisions. Most of are aware in terms of what is a fiscal deficit, in terms of the GDP contraction which has happened in this year, what is GDP growth for the next year. But I would specifically like to deal with two specific announcements which the finance minister has made. One is the FDI in insurance, a very positive step. The FDI is increased from 49% to 74%, and this would clearly see a huge amount of the FDI flow into this sector. Extremely positive, and we'll have to wait and watch in terms of what are the M&A transactions which are now waiting to happen in this sector. The second point which I would like to cover on this slide is the InvIT and REIT related, which says debt financing by FPIs are now permitted for funding of InvITs and REITs. Very positive move on this in this direction, because a lot of funding would be required by the infrastructure sector and real estate sector, and equity or subscription to units was the only way in which the financing would have happened. Now even the debt financing would be possible. So I think again it's a very interesting development and would give much needed boost to this entire sector. Moving to direct tax proposals. First, let's look at the proposals which are concerning the GIFT City or International Financial Services Center. Very interesting changes which have been brought about. The first set of changes is in terms of the migration of the funds from the overseas jurisdictions to the GIFT City. What has been provided is that any capital gains arising on the migration or the relocation of the funds from either Mauritius, Singapore or any other jurisdiction into the GIFT City would be completely tax exempt for the funds as well as for the shareholders or the unit holders. So this particular exemption was missing, and it really acted as a hindrance for the overseas funds to relocate to the GIFT City. So I think a very welcome change, and this relocation has to happen before 31st March 2023, subject to certain conditions which are, to my mind, are not very difficult to comply with. The second related point is that in case the funds are relocated to GIFT City, the subsequent capital gains arising out of the sale of shares by the funds would continue to be tax exempt even for the funds which are located in GIFT City if those capital gains were tax exempt in the original situation. So for example, if the Mauritius fund had invested in a debt security in India in a portfolio company, and if Mauritius fund had exited the debt security, it would have availed the tax treaty benefit of India Mauritius, and it would have been tax exempt. The same tax exemption would continue in case of subsequent capital gains as and when the exit happens by that fund from the GIFT City. So very thought through proposal, and it takes care of the entire gamut of relocation of the funds from the overseas jurisdiction to the GIFT City. The third point is again the losses which might have been incurred by the SPVs and which are held by the fund. The losses will not lapse, because in case the shareholding changes by more than 51%, the losses would lapse. So the care has been taken and the provision has been made to ensure that even the losses would not lapse on account of such migration. Similarly, there is one more provision, which is Section 56 of the Income Tax Act, which again says that if the transfer happens at cost and the recipient would not be liable to tax under Section 56, even that exemption has been provided for. So all in all, almost all the provisions have been taken care to ensure that the migration from the overseas jurisdiction to GIFT City is tax neutral. So that's the first set of provisions. Coming to the second set of provision is in case of the capital gains exemption for the investment division of offshore banking units that has been granted category 3 AIF registration. Again, that's an additional provision which has been made, and it would be completely tax exempt for the transfer of those specified capital assets. And the unit has to commence operations before 31st March 2024. Continuing with the incentives which are given to financial services sector, very interesting, again, a provision is made again for a GIFT City units. You may be aware about Section 9A in the Income Tax Act, which provides for relaxation of several conditions for the asset manager which is located in India not to be regarded as taxable presence for the overseas fund, provided the manager in India satisfies certain conditions or the fund satisfies certain conditions. Those conditions were found to be quite onerous, and to the best of my knowledge, very handful of funds do actually satisfy those conditions and qualify for the exemption under Section 9A. Now the law is amended to provide and relax those conditions if the unit or if the asset manager is located in the GIFT City. Again, a very welcome change. We'll have to, of course, wait and watch in terms of the actual notification as to which conditions are actually relaxed to provide exemption for the fund manager from creating a taxable presence of the fund in India. The next provision is the income from securities received by FPIs. A very interesting situation had arisen few months back when Supreme Court, in case of Pilcom, passed a judgment to say that any income which is arising from India and for which the withholding tax rate is prescribed under the Income Tax Act, then that rate of withholding tax would be applicable for the deduction of tax while paying that income to the recipient outside India. In other words, the rate of tax under the tax treaty, even though it is lower, cannot be applied by the payer while remitting the income to the overseas recipient. The ruling actually had very unintended consequences, and especially for FPIs, where there is a specific section which provides for the rate of tax of 20% on all the income which is payable to FPIs as TDS. Now, for example, if the FPI is coming from or investing from a jurisdiction which is say Mauritius, and if the rate of tax, withholding tax on dividend is say 5% under India-Mauritius tax treaty, the Indian payer could not apply the 5% rate of tax because of PILCOM ruling. Similarly, if you look at the rate of withholding tax on interest under India-Mauritius tax treaty, which is 7.5%, even that rate of tax, withholding tax, could not be applied by the payer while paying interest, again because of PILCOM ruling. And the payer would be forced to deduct tax at the rate of 20%, and the FPI in its tax return would be required to claim the refund by claiming tax treaty benefit. This would result into blockage of cash, and there are a lot of cash flow issues arising therefrom. FPIs did make representation on this aspect, and the amendment has now come through to provide that the tax withholding to FPIs on the income payable to them would be now in accordance with the Act or the treaty rate, whichever is more beneficial to them. Again, a very, very welcome provision. The next amendment is with respect to dividend income payable to REITs and InvITs. Again, look like a very unintended provision which was existing on the income tax statute, which provided for 10% rate of TDS for the dividend payout to REITs and InvITs, even though REITs and InvITs are not liable to tax on dividend income from the portfolio companies. Of course, when REITs and InvITs further declare dividend to the unit holders, again the TDS applies depending on the various who is the recipient and certain other conditions. Now that unintended consequences sought to be rectified, and the provision is now made that there would not be any TDS for the dividend payout by the portfolio companies to REIT and InvIT. Again, extremely positive for the REITs and InvITs sector in the country. Infrastructure debt fund is added to the list of eligible issuers of zero coupon bonds. Again, it has to be notified by the government, but again, an extra source of funding for the infrastructure debt funds. There are certain provisions in the budget which are actually provided for, or law has been amended to neutralize some of the case laws which are, or judgments which have been passed by the High Court or Supreme Court in past, which are actually favoring the taxpayer. And those amendments have been made to neutralize those judgments and make some of those events taxable. One of such thing is taxability arising out of dissolution or reconstitution of the firm AOP or the BOI, the body of individuals. We have several judgments on this aspect as to what is the tax treatment of the distribution of assets or cash or distribution of capital asset in case of dissolution or reconstitution of the firm AOP or BOI. This includes LLP as well. And some of the case laws, including a Supreme Court ruling in the case of Mohan Bhai Pamabai, had held that some of these distributions are not taxable at all if it is not in the form of cash. So several judicial precedents existed on this aspect. Now the law is amended to say that any receipt of capital asset or any other asset or cash would be liable to tax upon the receipt by the member of the firm or the partner of the firm in the hands of the partnership firm in case of either dissolution or any reconstitution. So we'll have to wait and watch as to what is being sought to be covered by reconstitution, but the reconstitution can have a very wide meaning, and virtually any situation or any reconstruction of the partnership firm or in the members or in the profit sharing ratio could actually be covered as a part of this provision, and such amount would be liable to tax in the hands of the firm. What is provided is that the computation, if in case the distribution happens of the capital asset, then the computation would be in a particular specified form. And if the distribution happens of an asset which is other than capital asset or cash, then the provision has been made to compute tax in a particular manner. It's a bit complex provision which they have made, but the care has been taken to virtually cover all possible situations of distribution of any form of asset, either capital asset or non-capital asset or cash. And all those situations are now made liable to tax in the hands of the firm. The next set of provisions is in case of TDS. Earlier, there used to be TCS, the tax collection at source on the sale of goods, which was levied by the budget of the last year. Now TCS has been now replaced with TDS. So buyer is now liable to deduct TDS at the rate of 0.1% on payment exceeding 50 lakhs for purchase of goods. So this is likely to increase compliance burden, but obviously the stated objective is to track the buyers, track the sellers, track the income which is generated out of large transactions, and the TDS has to be deducted in advance, and therefore the tax is deposited with the government, and then the seller is clearly forced to file the tax return, adjust the TDS liability against the tax liability of the seller, or claim refund as the case may be. The provision is also made if there is no permanent, if there is no PAN which is furnished by the seller, then TDS rate has to be increased to 5%. Similar provisions are made for higher rate of TDS and TCS in some other situations where the recipient has not filed tax returns for 2 preceding years. A very, very interesting provision. Again, the intention is to encourage the recipient of income to file tax returns in case they are required to file the tax returns. And clearly the responsibility is on the payer to determine whether the tax returns were filed or not by the recipient. And if the tax returns are not filed, in that case, the higher rate of TDS or TCS as the case may be, which would apply. The rate is the higher of the twice the applicable rates or 5%. And this provision will be effective from 1st of July 2021. The compliance and assessments related provisions. The provisions relating to due dates of filing tax returns and the assessment proceedings are rationalized. Broadly, it appears that the time period has been reduced in most of the cases by 3 months. So last date for filing the revised tax return is reduced from the end of the relevant previous year to 3 months prior to the respective assessment year. So it's reduced by 3 months. So now the period available is 9 months. Similarly, where firm or LLP is subject to transfer pricing, due date is now in a way being consistent with the date of filing tax return for the firm, for the partners as well, which is 30th November. Similarly, the time limit for assessment proceedings are reduced. Again, I think it's quite a welcome step. Just reduces the backlog and helps clearing of the pendency of the proceedings. So for summary assessment, from 1 year, it is reduced to 9 months from the end of the financial year when the tax return is filed. For the scrutiny assessment notice to be issued, it is reduced from 6 months to 3 months from the end of the financial year in which the tax return is filed. And for the completion of assessment, the 9 months from the end of the assessment year instead of 12 months from the end of the assessment year. A very, very interesting provision, very interesting change which has been made, extremely positive for the taxpayers, which would certainly reduce uncertainty in terms of reopening of the cases. And we'll have to again wait and watch in terms of the implementation of this well-intended provision by the assessing officers and the tax office in general. Essentially, currently the reassessment under section 148, those notices can be issued and the assessment can be done within 4 to 6 years in almost all cases, except the case involves overseas assets or there is a search case where the time limit is much higher, up to 16 years. Now that period of 4 to 6 years has been now reduced only to one figure, which is 3 years. So in almost all cases, of reassessment where the tax officer feels that there is a need to issue a reassessment notice, then it cannot be issued beyond a 3-year period from the relevant assessment years. A very, very important and very positive step. Only where assessing officer feels that income has escaped assessment, in that case, and which is in excess of 50 lakhs, in that case, the time limit is extended to 10 years. Also, there are further checks and balances before issuing the reassessment notice, the opportunity of hearing to be provided to the taxpayers, and the prior approval of the higher ups, the principal chief commissioner or the principal CIT, as the case may be, is required to be taken before issuing this reassessment notice. Covering some other provisions. Again, a very positive change in terms of advance tax. No interest to be charged for shortfall in the payment of advance tax, which is relating to the payment of the income of dividend under section 234C. What happens is that it is sometimes difficult to predict the amount of dividend to be received in a year, and advance tax installments are due right from the first installment, which is June, September, December and March. The provision existed for capital gains where the advance tax liability arises only when the capital gains actually arises to the taxpayer. Now the similar provision is made for the dividend income as well. Only when the dividend is declared by the company or paid, whichever is earlier, then only the recipient is required to pay the advance tax installment on those on that income. Again, quite a pragmatic and a realistic step which is being taken. Increase in safe harbor limit for home buyers and real estate developers. Essentially, section 43CA and section 56 have been amended. Section 43CA for the real estate developers on sale of the property, and for the home buyers under section 56. In case the stamp duty value is higher by 10% of the stated value, then the tax office was free to substitute the stamp duty value instead of the stated value of consideration in the agreement. In order to promote the sale of inventory and because of the current pandemic situation, to provide the boost to the industry, that 10% limit is now increased to 20% limit. So even if there is a variation of 20% from the stated consideration and the stamp duty value, the actual stated consideration would be considered to be the consideration for the purpose of computing capital gains. The provision is applicable only up to 30th June. So it's actually starts from from November 2020 up to 30th June 2021. And the value of the property should not exceed 2 crores. Presumptive taxation for profession not applicable to LLPs and companies. That change has been made. Income from retirement benefit account opened in notified countries by the residents while being non-resident in India to be taxed in a prescribed manner. Extremely important. We'll have to again wait for the conditions which are being prescribed by the government to see as to how they are giving relief to the income from such retirement benefit accounts which are opened by the residents who are residents today, but who were non-resident when they opened those accounts to receive the social security benefit in those countries. Clearly, when they become resident, their global income becomes liable to tax in India, and some relief has to be given for income received from such accounts. So again, we'll have to wait for the rules to be prescribed, but I would presume that those income would not be liable to tax in accordance with the tax treaties, respective tax treaties with those countries. Interesting provision with regard to ULIP issued after the only provision which is effective from 1st of February 2021, where any ULIP issued where the annual premium exceeds 2,50,000, then no exemption would be provided under section 10 for any income received on ULIP. And such income would be now taxed as capital gains Mostly it will be a long-term capital gains liable to tax at the rate of 10%. Depreciation on goodwill. Many of you may be aware that the Supreme Court, in case of Smith Security, held a couple of years back that the goodwill as an asset which is generated as a part of either acquisition or a merger is a depreciable asset, and the company which is acquiring goodwill is eligible for claiming depreciation on goodwill as intangible at the rate of 25%. It seems this particular provision has not gone well with the legislators, and now the law is amended in a way retrospectively or retroactively to provide that goodwill is not depreciable asset at all, and no depreciation is admissible on goodwill creation either on acquisition or on merger. This provision is applicable from the current financial year 2021. So even any amended transactions which have been done in this year would be impacted by the amendment of this particular provision. Not only that, any goodwill which was created several years back and depreciation was being claimed in last years will no longer be eligible for any further depreciation going forward basis. The law also has been amended to provide for computation of capital gains as and when the goodwill or the business is sold in future years. Similarly, there are case laws which have provided that in case of business transfer by one entity to another entity, and if it receives consideration other than cash, then such slump exchange is not liable to tax because it does not fall under any of the provisions of the Income Tax Act, and therefore it does not give rise to any tax liability. The current provisions provide for slump sale, and slump sale is liable to tax as capital gains. Slump exchange, the view was taken that it is not liable to tax at all. So again, the law is amended to provide that even though the slump exchange happens for a consideration other than cash, it would continue to be liable to tax under the relevant provisions of the Income Tax Act. So as we would see, several of the past High Court or Supreme Court judgments have been in a way neutralized or overruled by way of making amendments in the Income Tax Act where the legislator thought that that was not the intent of the current provisions, and in a way they were clarified to provide that those events are actually liable for tax under the Income Tax Act. Various tax incentives to startups were already provided in earlier years. They are now extended by a year from 31st March 2021 to 31st March 2022. So first is like a tax holiday which has been enjoyed by the startups, and second was the capital gains tax exemption for the recipient of the income who invest in the share capital of startups. Both are extended by a year up to 31st March 2022. Some other provisions which are very significant to my mind. Constitution of new Board of Advance Rulings. The current system of authority for advance ruling is now on statute for last several decades, but it seems that it is not working well. Either the chairman is not appointed or some members are not appointed, and therefore the AAR, the authority, was not functioning at all, and there was a long, huge pendency of the cases before the AAR. In order to avoid this situation, now actually AAR is abolished and a new body has been proposed to be constituted, which is Board of Advance Rulings. Currently what is stated is that there would be 2 members of the Board of Advance Rulings who would be not below the rank of Chief Commissioner, and they would be giving these rulings now, which may not be binding on the taxpayer. So that's a material change from the regime of authority for advance ruling. And also it is now formally provided that the rulings given by the board for advance ruling can actually be appealed against in the High Court. So it's a major shift and clearly an acknowledgement of the fact that authority for advance ruling was not functioning satisfactorily and needed to be replaced by some more efficient mechanism. Similarly, Income Tax Settlement Commission is proposed to be abolished. An interim board has been constituted for settlement of the pending cases. Again, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that the Income Tax Settlement Commission was not effective in settling the dispute, and hence it has been discontinued. Unfortunately, no alternate mechanism for dispute resolution has been prescribed, and we'll have to again wait and watch maybe next year or year after if there is any body constituted for settling the pending disputes. A faceless scheme has been provided for appeals before the tribunal. So again, we are moving in a systematic way from the tax assessment to the commissioner appeals, and now the tribunal would be conducted in a faceless manner. Constitution of a faceless dispute resolution committee, but only for small disputes below 50 lakh rupees. So it's a step in the right direction, but we'll have to see. I'm not sure why the such a low threshold has been prescribed. I'm sure representations will be made to ensure that higher amounts of dispute can be referred to the dispute resolution committee, but currently it would only deal with cases below 50 lakh rupees. Deduction for affordable housing projects again is extended by a year from 31st March 21 to 31st March 22, and it has been extended to notified rental housing projects as well. With that, I've covered all the key direct tax proposals. I would hand it over to my partner Ritesh to cover key indirect tax proposals.
Just give me a minute. Hi, good evening, everybody. So if I look at the budget from an indirect tax perspective, just laying down the broad theme, the same can be divided into two broad baskets. So one is Atmanirbhar, Made in India. This has been something which the government has been pursuing for the past few years in terms of ensuring that we do not import goods and we manufacture the goods in India. The other is changes relating to plugging certain loopholes under the GST law. Now, when I say loophole, means they were lack of substantive provision. There were rules to sort of take care of those situations, but there was a lack of substantive provisions. What the government has also done is strengthened certain recovery provisions under the GST law. Now, coming to the specific amendments in this slide. So there is section 7 which deals with provisions of supply. So this is the charging section which talks about what transactions could be considered as supply, has been retrospectively amended. And what this amendment has done is primarily to bring in supplies of goods or services by clubs or by cooperative societies or association of person or body of individuals within the ambit of the tax. Now, when I say within the ambit of the tax, there was a dispute with respect to whether clubs or societies provide services to its own members. And the Supreme Court in Calcutta Club and Ranchi Club has taken a view that they are not liable because a club is not different from its members. So the mutuality concept, however, a specific provision has now been introduced to say that they are the club or the cooperative society and its members are distinct persons. The same applies to a association of persons. The same would apply to a body of individuals as well. The next amendment is a very critical amendment and which is the conditions for grant of GST credit. You all must be aware of the entire famous 2-2A reconciliation. So what happens is that today GST credit is available and this is what department contends, that GST credit is available only after the supplier files his returns and reports its transactions in its output tax So GST output tax return, which is GSTR1. So when he reports the transaction in its output tax return, the same gets reflected in my GSTR2A. There was a dispute in terms of whether can the credit be disallowed basis if the supplier has, let's say, not reported the transactions. The way the GST law was earlier contemplated, there was a proposition to say that if the transactions do not get reported, then the recipient will have to reverse the credit along with interest. However, the relevant provision which talks about reversal were never notified, so which is section 43A. Now, what the government has done is, rather than going into section 43A and notifying those provisions for reversal, they have now put a specific condition around this to say that till a supplier does not file its returns and report those transactions and communicate such transactions to the recipient, the credit would not be available. This would have a huge impact because today, apart from doing your own compliances in terms of filing returns and reporting tax, you will have to also ensure that your vendor complies, files his return, pays his tax so that you can take credit. There is another larger issue around this to say that if the vendor has not paid tax, so there is a decision in Arise India, which is Delhi High Court, which has held that if the purchases are genuine and bona fide, then the credit cannot be disallowed. So you have made the payment to the supplier of both the purchase amount and the GST. And when I say purchase amount, both for goods and services, and the transaction is a bona fide transaction, the credit cannot be sort of disallowed. Now, what happens to those decisions after this particular amendment has come will have to be seen. However, it is important for corporates to now sort of ensure that credit reconciliation is done on a monthly basis and vendors are followed up on a monthly basis to ensure that they go ahead and pay the tax. One good news is that the mandatory audit requirement, which is GSTR 9C, this was an annual audit, has been done away with. However, while this is a good relaxation, this has been replaced by a provision of self-certification by the relevant authorized signatory. So this could be either the tax head or the CFO, who is the relevant person who is authorized to certify such statement. Now, in a way, this puts a larger onus upon such individuals who are going to certify such reconciliation statements, because they will have to ensure that taxes have been paid correctly and the credits have been taken appropriately. Today, when GSTR 9C is prepared, it is actually sort of contended to say that an auditor is not supposed to verify positions. He is only supposed to do a reconciliation. But when a company personnel is signing such a reconciliation statement, can he say that I would not verify position? I just have to ensure that this sort of reconciles with my books of accounts. So while a welcome change, however, there are challenges which it creates for the CFOs or the tax head who would be signing such reconciliation statement. So 9C will still have to be prepared and 9C will still have to be filed, but with self-certification. You all must be aware of this entire issue on levy of interest on net cash liability, which is section 50. And the question was that if I do a delayed filing of return, I have credit lying in my books. I have a tax liability which exceeds the credit. So if I would have filed the returns in a very timely manner, I would have paid the net cash after deducting my credits. Now, what department started alleging was that no, if you have filed the returns delayed, I will not allow you the credit. So you would be allowed the credit for the purposes of adjustment, but interest I would calculate it on the gross value. Now in October 2020, this got sorted out by issuing a notification. However, the notification was prospective. So, but there was also a circular which was issued to say that all such matters would be kept in the call book till the government is able to do a retrospective amendment, which can only be done in the Finance Act. Now that amendment has come. GSTR 1(3)(b), many of you would from the department to say that there is a mismatch between GSTR 1 and 3B. Now what it means is that if you have been, GSTR 1 is where you report transaction wise, where you report your tax payment, tax credits, a summary of tax payments and tax. So you report the total value, the total credit, and then you pay the tax through GSTR 3B. There were many scenarios where what you report in GSTR 3B was different from GSTR 1. Now that normally should not happen because 3B has to be made on the basis of GSTR 1. GSTR 1 is only a detailing of transactions which are ultimately reported in 3B. Despite that, there were many situations where this has happened. Transactions were reported in 1, probably deleted at the time of GSTR 3B. Now and whatever taxes were declared in GSTR 3B was understood to be a self-assessed tax which the taxpayer has to mandatorily pay. Now provisions of section 25 has been amended to say that even the amount that you reported in GSTR 1 will be deemed to be a self-assessed tax. Now what does it mean? It means that if your values reported in GSTR 1 are higher than GSTR 3, the department can initiate recovery provisions as if it was a self-assessed tax declared by you. So this is again a very key change. Now companies will have to ensure that there is no difference between a GSTR 1 and 3B. There would be some difference. Let's say, for example, if there are negative values in 3B because of some credit note, etc., carry forward or credit note, but those are genuine differences. But other than that, let's say, for example, cancellation of transactions, etc., ought to be avoided. Multiple notices have been issued on this in the past. Provisional attachment. So the provisions provide for provisional attachment to protect interest of revenue, which can be done by a commissioner if is of the reasonable belief that there is if the department does not take action immediately, it could jeopardize the interest of the revenue. This was, however, currently only restricted to non-filer of returns, unregistered dealer, summary assessment, and show cause notices issued under the law under section 73 and 74. So 73 is without fraud suppression and 74 is after an allegation of fraud and suppression. This has been considerably expanded to cover all situations of assessments, inspection, search, seizure, arrest, demands, and recovery. So any proceeding which is initiated under the GST law and the commissioner is of the belief that he has to attach property provisionally, he can just simply go ahead and do so. And this is even without following the due process of law. This the notices under 73, 74, personal hearing, etc. could continue. However, if he's of the belief that there is a risk to revenue, he will attach, and any attachment which is done can be valid for a period of 1 year. Now, in addition to the persons who might have been issued show cause notices, etc., what the provision also says is such an attachment can also be made to a person who retains the benefit of a transaction. So not only the noticee, but somebody who has got benefited out of the transaction. Now, if you would remember, last year there was an amendment to section 132. Now 132 provides for arrest in case of certain specified transactions. So if somebody is issued a fraudulent invoice, or if somebody has supplied goods without invoice or taken a wrong credit. Now in that provision, it all as well under 132, the provisions had added arrest for beneficiary of a transaction. The same similar amendments have now been sort of made under the provisional attachment provisions as well. Important changes under the IGST Act applies in a situation where we have export of either goods or services. So earlier there were two options. When I say earlier means the current law, there are two options. So as you would be aware that exports are zero rated, so you don't have to pay any tax on output. So whatever input tax credit that you accumulate, you can claim a refund. There was also another alternate option whereby I could have paid the tax on the output transactions and claimed the refund of the tax paid on the output transaction. Now why payment of tax was done was, so for example, refund was not applicable to capital goods credit. I could have only utilized that capital goods credit and taken a refund. Or there could be situations of carry forward of credit because refund was only available for credit taken during the month and was applicable and was calculated by way of formula for export during the month. Now this takes away a very substantial option for the taxpayer, so who has substantial amount of exports and huge amount of input credit on account of capital goods, etc. Now what the government says is that it may notify a class of dealers or class of goods or services, class of persons or goods or services who may still go ahead and pay on payment of IGST. Now such notification would come maybe after the finance bill received presidential assent. Another important thing is that if you are supplying goods or services, and in our context, services to SEZ. Now services to SEZ are zero rated. Now they have specifically added a condition which was sort of an understood condition earlier, though it was debated to say that there is no specific provision, to say that the zero rating will only be applicable if it is for authorized operations. So let us take an example where Dhruva is providing services for getting you a license or benefit under export, a benefit for exports. Now that is exports out of SEZ. Now will that be considered towards authorized operations? While it is arising out of exports from SEZ, is it for authorized operations of SEZ? Another amendment which is not relevant to the group per se is with respect to export of goods. So in the last budget, so if you are aware that for services export, you can claim a refund for input tax credit, and the transaction is treated as zero rated. But you have to receive the foreign exchange in 1 year. That is which is the time limit prescribed by FEMA. However, no such condition was there for goods. Now, in the last budget, they added a rule 96B prescribing such condition. However, there was no substantive provision to sort of say that you have to get this amount in foreign exchange. Only rule changes were made. Now that error has now been rectified, and a provision has been added under the IGST Act to say that you will have to get the money in convertible foreign exchange within 1 year, which is conditional time limit prescribed by FEMA, if you have to take the benefit of refund. These are some stringent provisions with respect to detention, search, release, and confiscation. Now, they were always there. Now, what has sort of happened is, considering this entire issue of fake invoicing, goods being transported without invoice being given without goods, etc., they have now levied very stringent, enhanced penalties on, vehicles who are transiting such conveyances who are transiting such goods. Earlier, when a confiscation, detention or seizure used to happen, tax and penalty both were levied. Now that has been segregated to say that there would be separate proceedings for tax. However, penalty will have to be paid, and the amount of penalty has been increased from 100 to 200%. There has been time limit prescribed within which the officer will have to pass an order, and then you can go into appeal. In fact, the appeal on the appeal front also there was a controversy of whether is there an appellate mechanism or do I need to go to the High Court. The onerous issue over here is that the authorities have been given the power to sell the goods within 15 days. Now, the time limit for filing the appeal is 3 months, whereas the goods can be sold in 15 days. So does it mean effectively that you only have 15 days from the date of passing the order to go and file an appeal? And also there is a need for payment of 25% penalty. Again, confiscation, there can be confiscation and 100% fine and penalty can be levied. So in all total 300% penalty, fines, etc. in transactions where there is contravention with respect to transportation of goods. Moving on to customs, as I've mentioned earlier, that the focus of the government has been made in India, Atmanirbhar, etc. So few critical points which were mentioned were that a systematic withdrawal of exemptions. So they did mention about 400 plus exemptions under customs. And the point is that all those exemptions would be reviewed and would be gradually withdrawn. What the government has also done is put a sunset clause for all the existing exemptions unless the exemptions are renewed. Now, the first amendment on the custom is levy of agriculture infrastructure and development says. Now, it does not have any impact per se on the applicability of duties, because what they've done is they've also done a consequential decrease in the levy of basic custom duty and levied an AIDC. Now, why this has been done is because the custom duty go to Consolidated Fund of India and it is shared both between center and state, whereas an AIDC only goes to the central government. So which means that the entire funds would be available to the central government for the purposes of agriculture infrastructure development. Now there is a slight bit of a debate on whether the increase in the cess is equivalent to the reduction in custom duty, because when we did the calculation for some product, there was a dichotomy between those two. As I already mentioned, that exemption notifications, and these are conditional exemption notifications, will only now remain valid for 2 years till the 31st March, occurring after such grant or variation, and if they are not renewed, they will be expiring. The current exemption notification will be valid till 31st March 2023. So which means that earlier perpetual, but now it would not be perpetual. It would come to an end with a due date unless it is renewed. From a Make in India perspective, job work has been allowed on goods. So manufacturing activity job work has been allowed at a concessional rate of duty. So you can import goods, get job work in India done and export the goods. However, this would be under the import of, so you have to follow the import of goods concessional rate of duty rules. So which basically speaks about strict end conditions in terms of, doing the job work activity and again re-exporting. One positive amendment which has happened is the time limit of 2 years specified for issuance of a show cause notice. So what used to happen practically was that when an investigation or inquiry was initiated, department used to take sometime 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to issue a notice. So there was a recovery which was made. the amount is pending, lying with the government, and show cause notice is not issued at all. Now, if a notice is not issued within 2 years of such audit, search, seizure or summons, then the proceeding shall deem to be closed. Very, very positive amendment. However, this would not apply to proceeding which have already been initiated before the finance bill receives the presidential assent. Some procedural changes. So today bill of entry can even be filed 1 day after the goods have come to the port. Now it has to be filed within 1 day prior. Now this is to ensure speedy clearances. With considering the entire digitization which is happening, there is now a common portal where everything will have to be filed, bill of entry, shipping bills, etc. Also, every order service would be by way of an electronic portal. The interesting amendment is the last bullet, which says penalty up to 5 times of the refund claimed on export of goods can be imposed, where input tax credit where you have claimed a refund of input tax credit on invoices obtained by fraud, collusion, suppression. Now this input tax credit is GST input tax credit. And the question is, if my claim for refund is under GST, my exports are under GST, how can, so there is, from a custom perspective, you have to file a shipping bill. But the question is, how can customs authority levy a penalty equivalent to 5 times of GST credit? My claim of refund is under GST law. This provision will, obviously this is for fraudulent refund claims, target fraudulent refund claim, will create some sort of a harassment at the ground level. But interesting to see from a legality perspective, how would this sustain? With this, I come to the end on the indirect tax proposals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Puneet and Mr. Ritesh. The session was very, very insightful, and I'm certain that the audience has taken away a lot from it. We have a slew of questions, but I'm going to be focusing on a quick few so that we can move forward. I think one of the first question which a lot of people are asking about, Mr. Puneet, I think you would be able to better answer this. How will the gold import duty impact the gold ETF? Or should I redirect this to Mr. Ritesh?
Yeah, I will take this up.
Yeah, sure.
See, what the government has done is they have reduced the, just a minute. Yeah, they've reduced the custom duty from the perspective of reducing the price of gold. That was the objective. Now we have seen 2 different scenarios. Silver has gone up and gold has gone down. Now, considering that the objective was to reduce the price, it seems that the prices could come down. That is what it appears. That was the objective of the government before, behind reducing the rate of customs duty.
So secondly, I think the second question is that people are worried about inflation. And they are asking, will it kick in by the second quarter of FY 2022? And will it put a pressure on RBI to hold lower interest rates? So what will your view on this be?
So I think actually we are tax professionals, and therefore we wouldn't have any specific view on some of these economic related questions. It's best answered by an economist.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies.
So there's a question on if TDS is applicable on property sale too. How should one proceed forward with it in case one is looking to go ahead with a property sale?
That provision, nothing has been amended in the current budget. That provision always existed in the Income Tax Act. So that would continue to apply. I think it's at the rate of 1%, it continues to apply. Nothing has changed on those lines.
And could you, on those lines, there people are asking about any new implications. I believe that you focused in your presentation about REIT, and people are asking any new implications for an investor, and can one go ahead and invest in these instruments without any short-term budget-related risks?
A very interesting question. REIT and InvIT has been a very peculiar structure which has been introduced for last few years, and several amendments have been made, or several simplifications have been made in the tax regime relating to REIT and InvIT over a period of last several years based on the demand of the industry. Unfortunately, it's like a hybrid structure, unlike an AIF, which is completely tax pass-through. REIT and InvITs are like partial tax pass-through. So, for example, they do pay capital gains tax in India. However, dividend income, for example, is complete pass-through, again, depending on certain situations. So, it is difficult to predict whether there would be any further changes in the regime going forward basis. But the current change which has been made is extremely positive, because there was definitely a cash leakage in the form of TDS at the rate of 10% on the dividends payable to REIT and InvIT, where dividend was completely tax exempt in their hands. So that 10% was like a mistake in the law, and which has been now removed. So it's an improved cash flow for the REITs and InvIT unit holders. So like the provision is that if the portfolio company is in 35% tax regime, then the dividend is completely tax pass through. Nobody else pays taxes on that dividend income.
So this will basically improve the cash flow for the investor?
Yes, it will substantially improve the cash flow for the investors.
Okay. I just wanted to quickly cover, we have a gentleman asking that the interest on contribution of more than 2.5 lakh per annum to PF is made taxable. Could you just, cover on that a little?
Sure. I think, sorry, we did not cover that as a part of our presentation. Again, a good question. I think this is the provision, section 10, 11, 10, 12 has been amended to provide for taxability of the interest income received on a contribution excess of 2,50,000 in the employee provident fund. This is this is prospective, and therefore to that extent the EEE, the exempt principle will not apply. It will be now EET, and therefore as and when the interest income which will be accrued on that balance in excess of 2,50,000 will be liable to tax in the hands of the employee. So this is prospective going forward basis, basically to discourage the large deposits in the provident fund voluntarily. Okay. That's the intent.
Okay, thank you. So, there are also several questions. Now I'll just club. There is the new Wage Act which is coming. Also, has something been mentioned about that in the budget, and something on the lines of the taxation on PF and PPF interest under the new regulations?
So that I just covered. There's nothing else other than that. There are only two provisions from tax perspective. One was what I just covered, tax on PF, EPF in excess of 2,50,000. That also interest income. And the second is relating to ULIP. Okay. Again, where the premium exceeds 2,50,000 per annum, then when the ULIP is redeemed, it will be now taxable and no longer exempt. And it will be taxable as capital gains at the rate of 10% tax. These are the only two substantive changes as I can see from a direct tax perspective.
So there is just one gentleman who needs a clarification that if a person has a ULIP from earlier years, then does the person have to pay any LTCG on redemption at maturity by 2022?
No, the answer is no. I don't think it is retrospective. It is ULIPs issued after 1st February 2021, just a few days back. That's the only provision in the union budget which is effective from 1st February 2021. So new ULIP policies, not the old ones.
I think that covers most of the questions. I believe that we have covered the overall gamut. Thank you, Mr. Puneet Shah and Mr. Ritesh Kanodia. Thank you for your invaluable time, your insights. We have received a lot of comments on the PPT structure. The audience found it very insightful. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for tuning in. Would you like to quickly summarize the session for us?
Sorry, that's a question to us.
Yes, would you have any closing remarks?
Sure. From a direct tax perspective, I would put it a bit of mixed bag. The direct tax proposals. Actually, it would have been like virtually 100% positive, but for various amendments which have been made to neutralize some of the tax benefits which the taxpayers were getting, like depreciation on goodwill, or the the dissolution of partnership firm or a slump exchange. At least these three, which are very substantive in a way tax benefit to the taxpayers arising out of Supreme Court rulings, which are now nullified by way of an amendment in a virtually retrospective or a retroactive manner. So I would like to believe that because of that, it slightly creates a feeling of mixed bag and something which where the taxpayers would be badly hit, I would say. But otherwise, most of the provisions are quite positive and in favor of taxpayers. That's how I would conclude on direct tax proposals. Yeah, Ritesh.
Yeah, no, just to further add to what Puneet said, three things which become relevant from what we see in this budget is which I already mentioned is made in India. So government is very clear that it would not allow companies to take unnecessary benefit on import of goods, claim unnecessary exemptions, and would want companies to start manufacturing goods in India. Another is, they would want to simplify GST laws, but with a very clear message that taxpayers will have to be compliant. There is a very strong focus on companies to ensure that they are reporting their taxes correctly, they're filing their taxes in the appropriate manner. There is no lapse. And as you could see, many stringent provisions have been provided under the law on action which could be taken if you're not doing so. And the compliances does not include, as I said, your compliances, but compliance by your vendors as well. Government is very clear that they would only give you the benefit of credit if the vendor is paid. So that's the broader theme to say that we'll simplify GST, but you have to be compliant. There is no option available.
So I think the overall broad guidelines is that compliance is going to be something to look out for in the coming years, especially in the next financial year. Thank you so much for your insights once again. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to all our audience. Thank you for tuning in. We shall soon meet for our next webinar. Till then, stay home and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.